during this webinar. Hey, Javan. Hey, Natalie. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having us, Raleigh. I so appreciate it. Love being back in the webinar space with you. And I'm really excited to be here with one of my colleagues and one of my favorite people, Natalie Pepin. Natalie, we've done this webinar before and it goes really well when you start us off. So floor is yours.
Well, I'll invite you to start sharing the slides, please, Javan. And hello, everyone. Tanshiki, wow. Natalie Pepin dishnikashun, pe kakisimo isqueo nitigasun. Tawati now niwi ken, pe Winnipeg dushjin. And isqueo ut pimshaknia, bien fem mechefnia. Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Pepin, and I am joining you from Tawati now, which means valley in English. And when we say it in English, we actually add another valley to the end. So I live in Valley in northern Alberta. So it's winter here and it's very cold, but I'm originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which in my opinion and perspective is right in the middle of the world. And that's where I grew up, and that's where my ancestors come from for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I am really excited to join you today with one of my favorite people, Javan Bernakevitch, and to talk a little bit about food security and the role that food security plays in looking forward into our future for our families. So Javan, I'll invite you to change to the next slide, please, sir. Thank you. So before we get started, it's important that we get to know each other a little bit. And with a group this large, unfortunately, and being online, we can't all sit and have a nice welcoming circle, but we will introduce ourselves so that you know a little bit about where we're coming from. So my name is Natalie Pepin, as I said. My background is in international relations and economic development. And so it's really interesting to be in this space that I'm in right now, but that's my, when I give my Western introduction, that's what I will start with. And I also teach traditional skills through my business called Reskilled Life. With our traditional skills training and programming, we're learning about all of the different ways we interact with our environment to meet our own needs and the needs of our families. And this includes looking at growing and preserving food, managing our relationship with food, which really is the most intense, long-lasting, far-reaching relationship that we have with this planet of ours, is how we feed ourselves. I also teach Indigenous arts and cultural programs through a program called Meeting My Ancestors, which is where I help connect Métis, so Utpimshak people with our culture. I live, as was mentioned, in Alberta, Canada, which is pretty far north. I'm about halfway up the distance of the province of Alberta. So I live in what's called Zone 3. Zone 3B specifically. And so that's a bit of my ecological context. I have 5 children and we live off grid on a homestead where we grow all of the food for our families, or most of it. There's a few things I don't grow, and preserve food and wild harvest and share traditional skills here on the land. And I'm really excited to be sharing on this topic with you today. Javan and I have been working together to do some amazing things when it comes to food and our relationship with it. And before I continue at all, I'm going to invite my dear colleague Javan to also share a little bit about himself and an introduction.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And thank you so much for the invitation to just think a little bit more deeply about our food today. My name is Javan K. Bernakevitch. I own and operate All Points Land Design, a life and land design company. I work on backyards to currently 6,500 acre projects. And in the land design space, I help to create more abundant, diverse, and if necessary, profitable landscapes that grow better every year. And on the life design side, I help individuals to get clear on their values, help make decisions through those values, and generally live a better life, again, getting better year after year. My background over the last 10 years has been deeply steeped in regenerative land design, where I have an open toolbox and an open mind with a number of tools. And one of the things that I've enjoyed so much about having an open toolbox is that nothing need be deified. No individual needs to be greater or lesser. No ism or ology needs to be the penultimate. And this is what's so fascinating about the colleagues and the connections that we can have in this life. And Natalie's one of these great examples, is that we can learn, and I've learned so much from Natalie's perspective and where she comes from, and it really enriches my own understanding. I'm a homesteader. I'm a reluctant farmer at times, as some of you know who have farmed. Hard to allow for people to understand the value that goes into making food. And clients of mine on the life design side have called me a life Sherpa, because I help them acclimatize and guide them to higher plateaus, and at the same time question the baggage they bring about with them. This conversation has really come up because last year a lot of were becoming polarized and recalcitrant, not only due to what we're dealing with internationally, but also some of the political changes that have happened also internationally. I just felt that people were being a little bit narrow-sighted. They weren't necessarily seeing that the skills themselves need not be attached to any ism or ology. And so I reached out to a good friend and colleague of mine, Joe Tobias of Root Shoot, who's a living soil consultant. And I said, Joe, do you want to offer a course about understanding and working with living soils? She said, yes. We had an amazing first course. I then reached out to Natalie. Natalie said yes. And we offered this incredible course called Family Food Security, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And over the last year, in just a few months, we've been able to put on 7 different courses. And this next year, we have many more coming in. And the only overarching concept of this platform, Regenerative Living Online, is that we're learning practical skills to live on the planet as if we intend to stay. We have a number of great courses coming up over the next year with Sepp Holter's American Progeny, Zach Weiss, with incredible individuals like Jeanette Hall and, of course, Natalie. Lots of great courses coming up. But what is really exciting about this platform is we have the ability to talk about and have bigger goals, goals that far outstrip us. And this was what Natalie brought to this year, and I'm participating in. Natalie, would you mind telling everybody about our big audacious goal for 2022?
Yeah, I think, it's important that y'all know where we're coming from in terms of why are we even sitting here with you. And part of that reason is that last year, watching all of these various factors that we'll talk about that are contributing to food insecurity and really wanting to do something about it. So one of the best ways to get to a goal and to reach that goal is to be clear about it and make it compelling. So I was talking with Javan. I was like, we need to have a goal and we need to set a big goal. And Javan threw out a number. I was like, no. I was thinking like 10,000. Let's try to reach 10,000 people this coming year and help them engage with food security, knowledge and skills. And he's like, okay, yeah, like we could do that. And I was like, and I think we should have a second goal. I think that we should have a goal of directly working with and engaging with 1,000 families to become more food secure this year. Now, these numbers are pretty big. They're big because we're just 2 people, but they're also big because they're important, because food security is becoming an ever increasing issue for so many families, both in North America and in many other places. So when we share this big audacious goal, our bag, it's something that we're really excited that you're participating in here. You are a part of this, of reaching 10,000 people. And now as you go forward after today, you're going to reach others in a discussion of food security and understanding your context and the context of your community in terms of your food security. So we thank you for being here. We thank you for participating in this goal that we have. And with that context understood of why it is we're here with you, I'm going to share a little bit more about some of those conditions around food security that are driving us as two individuals within a climate of the world of permaculture and homesteading and caring about the world that we live on, what it is that's happening around us. So these are some numbers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these. One of the driving factors around most people's understanding of food is food prices. When you go to the grocery store, that's a big way that a lot of people interact with their food shed. And what we're seeing, as was mentioned earlier, is an increase in the cost of food. Now, this is an average of a 30% increase. Now, it's important to remember when we see statistics, usually they are annual statistics, meaning it's a 30% increase from the prior year. And the interesting thing to note is that every year we have seen food cost increases. So if you were to look back 10 years ago, the average increase is going to be actually more than 30%. Now, in some areas of our food system, it's going to be less. And in some areas, it's going to be much more. These are Canadian statistics, I believe. Javan can talk a little bit more about where some of these numbers are coming. But it's important to understand, why are we seeing these increases in food costs? So one of the reasons where I am that we're seeing increases in food costs is because we're actually seeing a decrease in yield. Now, this is a complex topic to talk about, the growth rates of plants and how well they're doing in any given place or any given year. But one of the major factors where I am is we are in the middle of a multi-year drought. It's been going on for many years. And one of, being a livestock producer and being somebody who has engaged in our food system as a both consumer and producer, I can say that drought, for when you live in the city and you've got water coming to you through your taps and it hasn't turned off, drought doesn't really mean that much. But as a producer, what it has meant for me is that when I started raising sheep and goats and cattle, the cost of a round bale of hay, so this is a big bale of hay, was $35. And 2 years after that, it was $300. And the reason for this is when we have drought and we have a decrease in yield of those hay crops, we see a spike in prices. Now, these prices have caused a lot of producers to cull their herds heavily in the past 2 years. In fact, 2 years ago, when we had these astronomical hay prices, we were seeing wildfires across North America. We were seeing drought across North America. And this was felt everywhere. I remember seeing news of all of the impacts in Texas of this drought, and people from Alberta were actually shipping hay down to Texas to help manage some of those livestock feed needs. So it's a complex issue, and it's a really reinforcing cycle of changes in weather patterns and drought and increased water needs and wildfires and culling herds. So that means butchering or sending for slaughter a whole bunch of animals that would be the parents of the coming generation of livestock. But because those have been culled, there's less in the system the following year. So there's fewer animals to reproduce in the future. So it affects food prices, and specifically in this case, beef prices, for many years after. Now, we also have a global food shortage. So the 15% is an average of a lack of food for feeding humans with. We see supply line issues, especially right now. Over the past 2 years, we have witnessed the fragility of global supply chains and just-in-time shipping. So, these are wonderful things. It's great that we're connected in all of these complex ways and that we can enjoy produce and food from all over the place. But it's also presents some challenges when we become accustomed and reliant on those different food sources. And so right now, or at the time when this slide was made, it was an approximately 12-week delay for shipping. And this varies from place to place. So this is a picture of what's going on within the food system, but there's so much more. We saw processing plant closures at the start of the pandemic all across the province where I am. And what this meant, so we process most of the beef for Canada here in Alberta. And by most, I mean upwards of 90%. And our beef processing facilities closed because of the pandemic. And what that meant was that there were no animals being slaughtered. There was no beef being produced in the province that feeds most of Canada, and especially Western Canada. And so we saw in the grocery stores that there was just no beef to be purchased. It wasn't just that the prices had gone up astronomically right before there was no beef, there was just none on the shelves. And so there's this experience we're having as a North American community where we're experiencing food insecurity for some for the first time in generations. Now, that's not to diminish other people's experience. There are food insecure communities all across North America that have been food insecure for a long time. And it was mentioned that term food deserts, and that's a part of that. But this is the context of where we're coming from in our current food reality in North America. And this is one way of looking at these concerns that are present within our food system. We can go to the next slide, Javan. So with this, as I said, is one way to view our food system, but I also want to turn it over to Javan to share another perspective or another way of looking at some of these things.
Thanks, Natalie. Getting some good questions and conversations and comments in the chat about, is it a shortage? Is it a distribution conversation? And most recently in British Columbia, we saw major floods that cut off Vancouver, one of the major metropolitan cities in Canada, from the rest of the province. And the other issue that happened is that Sumas Prairie, which was originally Sumas Lake, which was populated by farmers and is populated by a huge number of dairy farmers within British Columbia, not only were not able to get their product out, but at the same time, they had an incredible amount of destruction of property, destruction of animals, which creates a shortage and creates a distribution issue. So what's important to keep in mind here is that it's going to be context specific wherever we are internationally, but with a number of different influxes, we're seeing all of these aspects affect us to certain effects depending on where we are. Good friends and colleagues in India and in Kenya are seeing things that we are first experiencing, but for decades. My good friends in Cuba have been underneath this type of food insecurity, if not for decades, for half centuries. I think what the big conversation here is that we're starting to see the instability of a centralized system instead of a decentralized system. And the argument here when we get into finances is we've got a lot of reasons to come to food security, be it that amazing satisfaction you have when you know your food's in your pantry. But for some of us, myself included, there's a frugality to it. There's a sense of, well, what am I investing in? And when we're talking about food and we're talking about purchasing food, we have to think about, well, what's the currency we're using to purchase that food? One of the things that Natalie and I teach in the course is how to use alternative currencies or barter or trade or harvesting or wild harvesting. But generally, if we're picking up food in the way that we've been taught within an industrialized food system, we're paying with currency. Now, generally, our currency is inflating. And with inflation, it means that we have less purchasing power of our money. That means the $100 you have this year, we are going to have 4% less purchasing power. It only buys $96 for the next conversation. When we add on top of that food costs, which normally rise 3 to 5% per year, but every single year, at least in Canada, we have a food report that comes out of the East Coast. We're seeing influxes up to 32%, sometimes rising to 18%. Meat in particular, specifically beef, as Natalie was talking about, and pork, are up to 30%. Different cuts of pork, specifically things like bacon and ham, due to abattoirs, butcheries, and smoking costs, are up 40%. And when you take a look at this in aggregate, not to mention buying in bulk or starting to trade or buying on seconds, all of a sudden you can have upwards of 16% of value. But on top of that, in bigger conversations, you can have more. And it's really interesting to take a look at what food can produce, because last year I do all the numbers on my food security, and I saved about 45% of what it would normally cost if I just bought from the store. Now, the great thing about that is that I get to eat it. It's not just a supply, it's an investment that actually accrues value. That's 45% of that money that I would have spent, time, money, energy, can go to something else. And this is something that Natalie and I are really specific about, is understanding and working with the big conversation. Why would we do this? What's our motivation? Because what we're trying to do is entice you, for whatever reason you come to this conversation, to really look at food security in a deeper, more multifaceted way. And with that, Natalie, I'm curious for you to start letting people know and starting to ask them, what is food security for your family?
Thank you, Javan. Yeah, I think it's really important that we remember everything is context specific. I remember taking a PDC with Javan years ago, and he wore a t-shirt and it just said, "It depends," because the answer is always, it depends. And it's important that we remember that our context matters, that we're coming to the place where we are from. And so I'm going to ask you, as we talk today about food security and building food security, how we view food security, I'm going to ask you to hold this question in the back of your mind. What is food security for your family? What does that look like? What is your food context in both your region, but also specifically within your family or within your community or culture? It's, when we start to look at those different contexts and the impacts of our food past, it's really, really important to remember that we've all had different experiences around food, and our current reality always looks different. So hold that question, and I'm going to share a little bit with you about where I am coming from in terms of food security and what food security has meant to my family in the past, and then also now. We can go to the next slide, Javan, please. So starting out, so my point A, if we were to look at it from a mapping perspective, my starting point, it was working in the trades. I was studying to become a photovoltaic installer, and this is about 15, 18 years ago, so a little while ago. And photovoltaics, they were just exploding in North America. They were becoming very popular. Installations were going up everywhere, and I was so excited about that. And I really wanted to be a part of it. So as a part of that training that I was taking through Seneca College in Ontario to become a photovoltaic installer, I was also working towards an electrical apprenticeship. So I was working in the trades, wiring homes, and I was loving it. I felt productive and I was contributing. I was working with my hands. I love building things. I absolutely love power tools. It was just so rewarding. But most importantly, in the trades, I was able to feed my family, clothe my family, house my family. I was making a good income, and I really enjoyed that too. So this was a really rewarding experience. Now something changed, something happened, and I was wiring the ceiling fixtures in a home, and the ladder that I was using, it failed. So there it wasn't mechanically safe, but it was what we were provided with by the home builder. And so we were working with what we had, and I fell, and I ended up off work for 6 months, unable to walk and in rehabilitation because of that. And my family went from, really doing quite well and enjoying all the overtime I could get, and to the point where financially we had to make a decision between paying rent and buying food or paying the car payment. And so this was the first experience I had where my family's food insecurity was lifted up in front of me, because at that point, what food security meant to me was going grocery shopping every 2 weeks. That was my view of what food security meant. And the reality is that's what food security means to most North Americans. It means having enough money to go to the grocery store and then just buying what you need. And if we were to break that apart a little bit more, it would mean, having the skill to cook meals, having kitchen equipment that allows you to cook those things. So I had all that. I had what North America viewed as food security. But what I came to understand is that I was actually incredibly food insecure, because in that period where I was off work, I was receiving insurance payments, but it wasn't enough to pay all of my bills. And so I had to eat from a food bank. I had to go to the food bank to get food for my family so that I could pay all of the other bills also. And this was humbling as a mother with children, and soon thereafter, a single mother with children. It was really hard for me to go through that experience, but it changed my perspective in a lot of ways, and it changed the focus of my life and the direction I was going in. So what I mean by that is recognizing this food insecurity, I shifted my career, I shifted my educational focus, and I began to learn about food security from a much deeper perspective. And what I came to understand was that the reason I found myself relying on a food bank was not just that I had no money. That's the most obvious thing. But in reality, it's that I didn't have food in my house enough to last me more than 2 to 3 weeks. It's that I didn't have the skills or the knowledge or the equipment or the space to grow food either. I had placed all of what was necessary for building food security for my family. That was all placed into the hands of others. It was placed into the hands of stores, grocery stores, producers, transportation systems, and I didn't have control over those things. I didn't have any of that, but I had the desire to change this. I had the desire to never have this experience again. Now, we can fast forward to point B. And I'm not going to talk about that journey in between right now, but I want to share with you where we got to and where we are today. So point B, we're living off grid in Northern Alberta, and we produce a year to 2 years worth of food every growing season. So that's what we grow for our family and put up. I have the knowledge of how to grow food and preserve food and raise animals. And most importantly, if it all went away today, I have the skills to make it happen again next year. And I have all of that essential equipment on hand. So that's a big difference. So to go from a 2-year food supply, food security means going grocery shopping, to taking back control over my family's food and relocalizing that skills and resources, the equipment, the knowledge of how to produce food and how to build food security has been huge for my family. We can go to the next slide, please, Javan. Now, what I realized is that I had barriers to food security. And some of those things, those factors that we talked about earlier, those are our collective barriers to food security. The increased prices, the shipping delays, the drought, all of those environmental factors. Those are our barriers as a North American and global community. But what I wanted was a deeper understanding. And so I broke this down into coming to understand that our barriers was in several different areas. So first of all, we have people. We have relationships with people with knowledge, people with a lack of knowledge. We have resources, information, skills, and materials. And all of that was needed to feed our families is outside of our homes. It doesn't exist inside of our homes or our communities. But we can see these as barriers. And there's a saying in permaculture, which I think is probably the most confusing saying in the entire body of what we call permaculture, and that's that the problem is the solution. We can go to the next slide, Javan. Now, clearly the problem and the solution are not exactly the same thing. But what this means to me is that when we have an understanding of the problem, it points us to where those solutions might be. So our barriers, they show us areas where we can develop robust resilience. It points out to us those issues within the reality that we're in, so our food reality. The fact that I didn't have enough food in the pantry, that was one barrier to my family's food security, but it showed me an opportunity to build food security by having more food storage in the house. You know, the barrier of not having the knowledge of how to grow food, well, that actually pointed me to an opportunity of learning how to grow food. We can go to the next slide, please, Javan. So all of these relationships with people, these resources, information, skills, and materials that's needed to build food security, those are all opportunities for our families. And what I did as I developed this understanding of these different barriers / opportunities for food security is I started to develop a process. We can go to the next slide. So the process that we use in the family food program, and actually that I use in a lot of different planning in my life in general, is called the Prism Planning process. And this is where we break down all of those different topics that we require in order to make something happen. So as a project manager, we have these processes, we break everything down into timelines and deliverables and action items and all of these different really important categories. So these are our categories for food security. And we can use this planning process to build food security for our families. Once we are aware of those barriers or those opportunities for improvement in our family's food security, we can use this process to begin to flesh that out and make it actionable. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to share one example of what that looks like, and using carrots. Now, when I first started growing veggies, growing up, my mom, she grew tomatoes, and we had some rhubarb that grew in the back, but that was really about it. My family didn't garden. And so learning to garden, it was exciting and challenging. One of the most beautiful examples of that challenge is one of the first years that I had a huge garden, and huge by urban standards. So it was just a big garden in the backyard. I grew carrots, and I love carrots. It's one of my favorite veggies. All my kids love carrots, and I was really excited to grow carrots. And I planted them, and I was doing the best I could and weeding them. And the carrots, they came out about that big. They were so stubby and tiny. I was just so proud of those carrots. And looking back, my pride in those carrots is kind of embarrassing, but they tasted great. And it was a part of that learning journey. But what I needed to do, and what I did, I needed to gather a whole bunch of things in order to grow carrots better. I needed people to learn from. I clearly was not doing well enough with growing carrots. So I used resources like YouTube, which was not the most valuable place to be back then, but it's much better right now, and it's an amazing resource for tutorials on how to garden. I used resources like seed catalogs that helped me choose appropriate carrots for where I was living, because I didn't understand the different varieties that existed and what was going to be effective where I lived. I needed the resource of money to buy carrot seeds. I also needed information, very specific information, like how far apart should I thin my carrots to be? And at what depth do I plant those carrots? How much water do they need in order to germinate properly? How long do they take to germinate? That's really specific information that I needed in order to become a better gardener in regards to carrots. But I also needed skills. And the first skill I needed was the ability to identify carrot seedlings from weeds. And I didn't realize this was a skill until I was sitting in my garden. And this is when I was running one of the largest CSA farms in my province. So we had a CSA farm that fed over 100 families. And for the province where I live, that's a big CSA. I know in the States, y'all have some really big CSAs. So context specific again. But I was sitting in the garden, and I had people come and volunteer to help me weed the garden, and they just kept pulling out my carrot seedlings, and I was just getting frustrated sitting there with them as I was pulling out weed seedlings and thinking, how is it that they don't see the difference? But what I realized in that moment, rather than getting upset, I realized that I had developed a skill to be able to see the difference between a carrot seedling and a weed seedling really quickly, such that my eyes, they just zoomed in on those weeds, and I could pull them out really, really quickly. I also had to learn another skill that same year. I had to learn to get the carrots out of the ground without breaking them. And in context where you're feeding 100 families, they don't want broken carrots, but you also have to be efficient with your time. So I had to learn how the heck I was going to get those carrots out and keep them whole and looking beautiful for the families we were feeding. So that was another skill I had to gain, and so many others. I also needed materials. I needed a garden hoe. I actually really like using a strap hoe for weeding in between the rows of carrots in my garden. I needed a rake, I needed seeds. I needed tarps to cover the rows of carrots to keep them moist so that the carrots germinated well. And this is most people's complaint with carrots, is that they don't germinate very evenly. And that's usually because they've lost too much moisture in those early days. So there was a lot that I needed to gather. But breaking the process of growing carrots down into steps like this, into categories, it helps organize what it is we need to go and get to make it an organized effort. And so this is one of those tools that we can use while building food security. We can go to the next slide, Javan. So there's different ways that we can view food security. And I think it's important that we remember food security. As we asked you the question earlier, what does it mean for your family? It's going to mean something different for everybody. And how we work on building food security, it's different for each family depending on their context. So what we're going to look at is, how could we build food security? What are those different areas that food security might exist for our families? And the first is looking at food storage as food security. So this is, when I said I only had enough food to last 2 to 3 weeks in my house, this is that part of food security where we look at, well, how much do I have access to immediately for my family? So we can break this down into different categories. And typically in the world of food security and planning around these things, we have 3 different time frames. We have emergency food supplies. So this is like 72 hours worth of food, or just whatever you normally store in your home at any given moment. You might consider that an emergency food supply. Then we have a short-term food supply, which is typically around 3 weeks to 3 months. 3 months is kind of the standard. And that's enough to get your family through an immediate emergency. So when you look at our governmental organizations and their food security recommendations of what people should have on hand, they'll say up to a 3-month supply typically, because it'll get you through a natural disaster or a family emergency where you fall off a ladder and you lose your job or your ability to create an income. So that short-term food supply is a really fantastic first goal for people. I've been running a 60-day food security challenge program, and the program has been focused specifically on gathering a 3-month food supply for our participants. And I'm excited to say that they've done beautifully. Some of them even gathered a 1-year food supply in the 8 weeks that we were together. So it's absolutely phenomenal. But that ability to know that if the roads are down, you live in Vancouver and the roads are down and it's going to take a long time to reestablish those routes, you have food to feed your family. You're going to be okay. And then the next is a long-term, what I call a survival supply. And that's a 3 to 12 months food supply. And personally, I'm working up to a 24-month food supply. And this is because I live in rural northern Alberta. And I don't go to the city very often. It would be prohibitively costly for me to drive to the city all the time to go and buy groceries as I need them. And so I have a 1-year supply of food on hand at all times. And for some people, they'd think, well, isn't that a little excessive? Do you really need that much? And that's context specific. Do I need that much? Yeah, I do. I have 5 children. I have a farm to run. I don't leave the farm all that often. And so for me, that's the amount that makes sense. But for most people, a 3-month food supply is really more reasonable. Now, there's other ways that we can view food security too. So we can go to the next slide, Javan. And that's with food production as food security. This is a different lens through which we can view food security. This is where we're gardening to grow that food. So with food storage, it doesn't matter how you get it. You could buy it, you could trade for it. Your neighbors could have helped you gather it. But with food production, we are becoming the producers of the food that our families use. And this might look like gardening. I right now have a very, very large garden in a large greenhouse that we grow our food in, but everybody could grow something, even if it's just sprouts in the kitchen window, in a jar. Everybody can be a food producer in some way, shape, or form. And in the program that Javan and I have put together, we talk about multiple different types of food production, so that it can match other people's context, because some of us have balconies, some of us have front yards, some of us have 24 acres to grow food on. So food production is one of those ways that we can engage with our food shed and with our family's food security. Gardening is often the easiest for people, but what I really wanted moving out onto a farm many years ago was to raise livestock. And specifically, I wanted cattle and chickens. And so the first thing that I did when I moved up to the farm in this valley here that I was renting originally is I bought a milk cow and a bunch of chickens. I was just thrilled to be able to develop that relationship with the animals that supported my family. And so this is another way that we can view food production. And for some people, it's raising rabbits. And for some people, it's not raising themselves, but it's becoming part of a cooperative that is supporting local farmers. Or I used to run with our CSA, a meat CSA. So it's called a meat share. You might join a meat share, and that might be how you have more involvement in your meat or animal product relationship. And the last is foraging or gleaning. Now, gleaning, what that means is you're going to go into where food was purposefully grown and help clean it up afterwards. As a producer, I know even after you go and pick all the beans, there's a whole bunch of beans hiding in there. It's just that it's not time effective to go back and do a third pass on those beans. But for one family to come out for a day to the farm and clean up all the food that's left over, that would make sense. That's a lot of food for them. And so you see this often with zucchinis in people's gardens where there's just too much. And so you could go and glean with their permission from their garden if they have an excess of something. We also see this with fruit trees, especially in older established communities, perhaps where the occupants of the home are elderly and they're just not going to be climbing up on that ladder and picking all those trees. So my family, what we would do when we lived in Calgary, a big city in Alberta, is we would volunteer to help people pick the fruit from their trees, and they would get some of it and then we would keep a lot of it too. And I was able to get 200 pounds of apples one year to make applesauce and apple pie filling and fruit leather for my family and apple juice. So that's a big opportunity for people in urban areas, is to help others out with their gardens and cleaning them up afterwards, and also those fruit producing trees. But we also have foraging. You know, one of the funny things that I've sometimes heard is living in a northern environment and being an Indigenous person, hearing this question is just kind of funny that, well, how do people even survive there? There's no food growing. There's so much food growing. You just have to know what it is and where it grows and what to do with it. Might not look like something you're used to eating, but it's food. And so foraging presents an opportunity for developing a deeper relationship with the land that we live on, and to come to know our environments even better. The beauty of foraging is there's little effort involved in growing and producing the food. Nature knows what she's doing. She's been doing it a long time. And so as long as we know where those places are, and we're being good stewards of that land, then we can go and we can pick food and use that as a food source for our families. So this is one more lens through which to view food security, but there's more. We can go to the next slide, Javan. Once we have food, whether it's from our gardens, whether it's from gleaning or wild foraging, we need to preserve that food. It only lasts so long if we don't do something with it. And I see on social media all the time in the summer, people grow these huge gardens, but they have not learned to preserve food. And so they are just inundated with food and overwhelmed with how much food that they have for a very short period of time. In our area, the growing season is maybe 3 to 4 months. And so they've got a lot of food at the last part of that growing season. And then the rest of the year, they're not benefiting from it. And so by learning to can or dehydrate, to freeze or ferment, to root cellar, which is one that gets me so excited, which is also called cold storage, or to store in our pantries, we can have food all year round for our families by learning these skills, whether it's just a part of our food or all of it. So food preservation skills, food preservation equipment, and knowing how to use that equipment, using it effectively. For example, when I was first learning to can, I was making salsa and jam, and that's fine. Salsas and jams, I can do that pretty well. And later on, I started to want to learn how to use a pressure canner. And so I was pressure canning everything. And I pressure canned kale once. And this was out of complete ignorance of what that was going to taste like. And so I pulled it out the first year that I had done that and was using some in food, and nobody would touch it. Nobody was going to eat that food because it was part of my learning process that we don't can kale, we freeze kale. And so maybe for your family, they love that. But for my family, they just wouldn't touch it. So we have experiences and relationships with these bodies of knowledge to gain by practicing these skills, by seeing what works for us, what tastes good, what's absolutely gross, and we'll never do that again, and how much of it that we need, how much food do we actually need to preserve to feed our families for a short period of time or for a whole year. So there's a lot that we can gather in terms of relationship, in terms of resources, information, skills, and materials on all of these different food preparation or food preservation topics. And finally, we go to the next slide, Javan. There's one more lens through which we can view food security from our perspective. There are other lenses that we could view food security from in a broader perspective, though. And this one is food sheds. So food sheds are a source of food security. Some of you might be thinking, well, what the hell's a food shed? And what does that even mean? And this comes from the notion of watersheds, where we look at the movement of water through a landscape. So we have, the precipitation, and it's gathering in streams and perhaps from groundwater, and it's moving through the landscape, gathering into rivers and lakes, and eventually making its way out to the ocean. And so those areas where water is moving and it's one cohesive connected space, we call that a watershed. But we also have that within our food realities. So we have the spaces where food is grown, processed, transported, shared, and eaten within a community. And that's what we call a food shed. So our food sheds are the relationships that we have with producers, with other families, with processors in our communities, with retailers, but it's also with community organizations. In Edmonton, a city that's close to me, they have community centers where they have commercial kitchens that people can go and prepare food. And perhaps your community has something like that, but they also have community gardens where people can learn how to grow food. Some of those community centers also have equipment that can be used in those community gardens. So perhaps a tool sharing library would also be a part of a food shed, where we're sharing shovels and rakes and all of those things that we need for growing food. And finally, we have facilities and spaces. This might be urban or, these spaces that are managed by people, or it might be wild spaces where our food can be collected or grown. So our food sheds are one other way of understanding food security. Now, Javan, I know that in your experience, food sheds have been a pretty big deal, and you've developed quite a knack at building relationships within your food shed. So I wonder if you have anything to add to this discussion around food security through food sheds.
And again, thank you so much for your story. I think it's one thing to go through this work, but it's another to understand somebody's story. And I just so appreciate you sharing yours. Food sheds for me has been a fascinating topic and a fascinating process, a exercise to go through with clients, as well as myself and my family, both the family that I hold locally in this house on this land, but also across this country and the other countries that I hold family in. And when we play with food sheds, we play with the idea of, where does my food come from? And as we know that we are what we eat, we also are what we think. If we track where our food comes from, where are the places we visit? where does that food come from the places we go to? Because the food that we eat doesn't come from the grocery store, it transits through the grocery store. The food that we eat, especially where I live, our closest quote unquote grocery store is the gas station. And for many that live rurally, the gas station can be a place that holds a little bit of food, both processed and packaged. And so by taking the time, and this is a great home experiment, this is something all of you can do who are watching this, and it's a great first step, is just to take out a piece of paper and to list, where does my food come from? Where do I go for food? What are the grocery stores specifically? Do I go to some versus others? Do I buy from restaurants? And if so, at what frequency? Do I buy in bulk? But what's interesting about this is when I was training to become a financial advisor, which I think is a big bullet I dodged, doing an audit always gave me and my clients a sense of, well, where are the leaks coming from, and where am I excited where I'm spending my money? And similarly, when you do a food shed exercise, be it on spreadsheet or on Google Maps, I've got both, you really see where your food's coming from and where it's moving to and where it's transiting to your family and to your food. How much does it cost you to go and get that food? And whenever I come into a new place, because I up until the last couple of years, I've been an itinerant land designer. So I've been moving from place to place to place. Landing in a new place for me is always getting to know the farmers. It's always getting to know the people who are growing and making spectacular food. And over the years, I've become a bit of a food hub in that I would have a special secret food list, because for me, I really appreciate what farmers do. And I do not want to invite a whole bunch of people who want to treat them like grocery stores to go and purchase from them. Being somebody who's always traveling, I can grow something in a year or 2 years, a season or two, but generally I had to create relationships out of food. Now, for those of us that are interested in building food security or food sovereignty, as Natalie alluded to, which is the ability to, if I lost all the food I have the skills, the ability, the processes, the way of speaking to build back my food security for whatever happens out in the world. And as a little bit of a sidebar, during the floods in British Columbia, the Highway 8 was completely cut off to the point to where they think the Highway 8 is going to take at least 2 years to come back to be able to be traveled on. And good colleagues and friends of mine had to be airlifted with their milking goats out of their house and their farm. They had 2 years of food security there, but they left with all their skills. They had all of that there. They had all the ability to produce that. So as we get to food security and as we get to food sovereignty, it's about creating relationships and conversations. And it's about taking the time to accurately detail, well, where is this food coming from and where am I putting my time, my money, and my energy? So for me, food sheds have been an amazing exercise for colleagues and myself, because it really gives me a sense of where am I putting my time and my energy. Back to you, Nat.
Thank you, Javan. And we can go to the next slide. So as we look at these different ways of viewing food security, I'm again going to ask you to think about, what is food security for your family? What does that look like? Where are you starting from? And most importantly, where do you want to be in terms of your family's food security? Now I'm going to share a little bit. I went and read the comments in the chat as Javan was sharing, and there's these different perspectives around what actually builds food security for us and what do we do about this. And again, we all have a specific context that we're coming from and experiences that we've had. And some of us have had experiences culturally or within our communities where we have had food insecurity used within the community as a tool. And that happened with my family, where eventually you're not allowed to go hunting and you're not allowed to use the land around you, and your homestead or farm is taken away, and so then you have no land to grow food on. But know that these pieces of knowledge, these skills, they follow you wherever you go. And resilience is this beautiful experience of taking whatever our context, whatever we find ourselves in. So for us right now, and we can go to the next slide, Javan, it's all of these different barriers we talked about before. This is where we find ourselves right now. This is our current reality. But we can take the skills, the information, all of those relationships we've built, and we can build up from that place. So regardless of where we're starting, regardless of that context of where we've come from culturally within our families, where we've come from, just within our own lives and our direct experience with food and food security, we can take wherever we're starting from and begin to build up from there. We can go to the next slide, Javan. So, looking at these food security issues, we have options to learn about what to do. So we can, as the people who joined our 60-day food security challenge went through the process of, we can gather a short-term food supply. That's one thing that we could do about food security. We could learn how to store food, and we could do that with a group of people and with some coaching and guidance along the way. Next slide, please, Javan. Or we can do that by joining a program that is specifically going to walk you through step by step the different ways that we can build food security. So all these different lenses that we looked at, what food security means, this is kind of the foundation of what we've built our program called Family Food Security on. And we look at all of these different things, from learning how to ferment food, how to can food, all these different processing methods, but also how to grow food, how to forage effectively. What will you forage? What's growing around you? What kind of equipment do you need in order to forage for that food? And also how to go about building good relationships within your food shed. So there's all of those topics, and I'm going to turn this over to Javan right away, but he's a perfect example of learning from whatever context that he's in at that moment, learning to build food security in that context. And so it's really exciting to be able to walk people through not only the experiences I've had in producing food for my own family, and also as a market gardener, but also in preserving enough food for my family to get through the year. And I really appreciate what he brings to that conversation in terms of consistently and effectively building relationships within our food sheds also. So I'm going to turn the time over to you, Javan, to walk us through to the end here and talk a little bit about family food security.
Thanks so much, Nat. We're going to have a quick conversation about the program, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if there are questions, feel free to put it into the Q&A, either about food security or the other aspects that we've talked about during the presentation. One of the things that I've learned over the last 13 years of being embedded in this type of living and this type of work is that we all learn from mistakes. They just don't have to be our own. And Natalie and I have spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of sleepless nights learning how to build food security in the shortest amount of time. As my great-grandfather always used to say, if you're going to ask somebody how to get to a place or what's the shortest direction, you should ask the guy with one leg. Why? Because he knows the shortest way. And what's great about conversations, what's great about learning is that you really want to find individuals that, one, you connect with and you enjoy, but two, are dedicated to offering a conversation or a solution that helps to guide you. And that's what I love about this program. This is a program that runs over 7 months from February to September, over the growing season for the majority of the continent. For those of you in tropical situations, we applaud you. I've lived there as well. This will be a little bit tighter in terms of your timeline. But what this program is it's a way to be guided and walked along step by step. Natalie is a spreadsheet phenom. We take your number of people in your family, we take how much generally food they eat of each meal, and her spreadsheets produce the bulk of the poundage or the kilograms of what your family eats. And from there, and this is incredible, she then has another calculator that then produces how many seeds you need, what are the linear feet row. And then with the Prism Planning process, we go from, okay, well, here's the big story. Here's how much food your family needs. And from here, how much of that do you want to grow? How much of that do you want to buy? And if you're going to buy in bulk, direct, are you going to have a farm share, a family share, a food share? Are you going to work with community supported agriculture? Are you going to glean? Are you going to forage? Something that I'm so appreciative of Natalie bringing to the program is coming from an Indigenous perspective. It's really about honoring the food that we connect with. It's about honoring the animals and the plants that make up the food that we are accessing, be it through gleaning or harvesting or hunting. And it's a very different perspective. It's one of the things that I so appreciate about Natalie, and one of the reasons why I love this course. We love the students we work with, and the response is pretty stunning. Individuals who have been doing this for years look at it in a completely different way, because they're not just looking at it as, well, how much food do I have on the shelf? How many vacuum sealed packs do I have in my bunker? It's what is the living food security, and more importantly, food sovereignty, the ability to bring food security back, that I have embedded in myself, in my family, in my culture. If I'm sick for a couple of days, do the people around me know how to pick up the slack that I leave in my wake of being absent? Do we have skills and process and tools? Because I've worked in land design for over a decade, I have so many different tools for so many different climates. I have 3 garden beds I didn't water at all during the heat dome at 52 degrees plus centigrade Celsius. If you want, you can look it up in Fahrenheit. I'm sure it's a ridiculous number. I didn't do any watering to those 3 beds, and it produced all of my squash. All of my winter squash that I've been eating is from those beds. This is what we like to pass on to our students, because we have the ability to share. Reasons why you might want to sign up for this course. Well, first and foremost, we've talked about it. Food prices are going up, and they're only going to continue moving up. Supply lines and supply chain and distributions and shortages are only increasing due to the variability and the uncertainty of the future that we face. And when we take a look at food scarcity, this is something that a good colleague and friend of Raleigh and I's, Seth Peterson, who's a chef and has incredible connections with chefs all around the United States. When I asked him about food security and shortages, he had a really interesting answer, because you and I might cook on a daily basis, but we don't buy food on a daily basis. Chefs do. And on average, they were seeing anywhere from 25 to 65% shortages of the foods that they want to buy regularly. That's a really important metric. That's a metric that I think we all need to take note of. If chefs are starting to see this, then it trickles down into those of us that are working at it. And why would you want to start early? This program starts February 8th. The sooner you start, the sooner you can start building your food security and, dare I say, food sovereignty. One of the things that we love doing with this work is we meet with our students early, we connect with our students early, and we give a lot of one-on-one support and conversations. We work on garden design, we work on food forestry design. All of that is embedded into this course. As clients have been saying, they love the clarity, they love the ability to watch. They enjoyed the banter between Natalie and I, because we know each other and we get to rib each other and really take it from a perspective that's really easy. And for everybody on this call, anybody who's interested in this, we have an offer for you, because we so appreciate you coming to this conversation. So between now, Tuesday, and Sunday, January 16th at midnight, the course is normally $5.99. And if you want to join us, you're able to join the course for $150 left. This is $449. It includes all of the conversations, all of the sessions. We meet 12 times over that 7-month conversation between February 8th and September. During those calls, we have coaching and conversations. We help folks with a coaching journal. We have all of the modules pre-recorded. You can watch at your leisure. We have all of the worksheets, the calculators, Natalie's incredible recipe list. We even talk about the recipe list when you're making food on batch, when you have it stored, because Natalie's in a situation where so much of her food has to be shelf stable, where she doesn't have a lot of freezer space. So she really has to choose about what food she puts in that freezer. We have the ability to really pass on that information to folks and work with them. So it's a great conversation for us. And again, if the program's not a fit for you, fantastic. Natalie has an amazing community, totally free of individuals. And so if you go to reskilled.com reskilled.ca/food security, you can join her food security community. It's a wonderful place to share, completely free. Natalie posts other people's posts. Her 60-day food challenge is phenomenal. And it's so great to see people jump into food and really take that conversation of what's next for our food security. So folks, I'm going to leave the slide up with the link, as well as I'll put the link again, and I'll put the coupon code for folks that are interested. There will be a replay of this available. I'll send out an email to everybody in the next couple of days, letting people know when the replay is up. Raleigh will put it up as well. And I think finally what I want to say is just thank you for being interested in food security. I think it's an important piece, a large piece, a conversation that, just like when we're not watching something that's slowly looming upon us, when it hits us, we have the ability to be resilient. It's not a huge conversation. It's not a huge problem. It's something that we can design around. It's something that we can build resiliency around. And I just so appreciate you being part of our big audacious goal this year. Natalie, as I start collecting questions for our next step, would you like to add final thoughts before we jump in?
Yes, thank you, Javan. Yeah, as Javan said, regardless of where you are, we don't expect everybody to come and join us for the 7-month food security process and investigation and work towards building your family's food security. That's not possible for everybody. And so wherever you are, whatever your context, we ask you to start taking steps to build your food security. Understand the different topics about food preservation and growing food, producing food, learning what you could harvest wild around you. Learn about all of these different aspects of food security, how to store food in your pantry. And that's going to allow you to build your family's food security. We invite you to, Javan just put the link in the chat to the free community online that you can join us. And we talk about our food goals as a community and different skills that we can be using. We have Food Security Fridays where we update and share our steps towards building our food security within that community. So we invite you to join us there. And we also invite you to stick around and have a discussion about food security. Ask your questions. Let's have a discussion, and we can explore all of the different contexts that we find ourselves in. So Javan's just posted tons of links in the chat there for everybody, so you can copy and paste whatever you need during our chat time together. And yeah, we're excited to have a conversation with you. We're so thankful for you to be here, and yeah, excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to open the chat here so that I can see what's going on in there. And oh, I like this one. Kathy just shared electricity grid fragility. We're designing and building a root cellar this year. Power can be out for hours or days or more in rural areas. Yeah, I've experienced that. I'm working on food sovereignty, but it's tough to keep fresh produce for long-term storage given our cold storage limitations. Do any of you have a root cellar? So root cellaring is, as I said, it gets me excited because I have recently being over the last 5 years, learned how to store carrots for a full year. And, root cellaring or cold storage is what technically we're doing when we root cellar. Cold storage is an absolutely phenomenal way to extend the life of the produce that we need by adjusting the temperature and humidity of the space where we're storing our foods. And for some people, having an in-ground root cellar is absolutely the answer. And this is typically for rural folks or people who inherited property that has a root cellar in a home that they live in right now. But it can also be a technique used by others. You don't need a root cellar to use cold storage methods. So this year, one of my goals is actually to dig a formal root cellar, below grade, in the ground, covered with earth. And it's actually going to be a rather large space because right now, the way that I store my food is in a shed. I live in a tiny home. I'm off grid. I have solar power, and it's not unlimited. My system, although I'm upgrading it this year, it can't run multiple freezers year round. And so I use a shed space that I have on a thermostat, and that thermostat is connected to a propane furnace that in the winter, we get about 6 months of winter. So in the winter, it keeps it at the right temperature, that the shed acts like a giant walk-in cooler. And in that shed, I have my water storage and all my food stored. And I have Rubbermaid totes. So those big plastic totes that we, pack Christmas decorations and extra clothes from a different season into. We use that, and you can either fill those totes with sand that gets really heavy, But for me, one of the pieces of ancestral knowledge that I used in my food security, one of the many, is the use of moss. So peat moss is one of the absolute best things that we could store our root veggies in. This is for many reasons. One of those reasons is it's high acidity, so it doesn't allow bacteria to grow very well. It holds moisture just right to keep those foods moist. Now, this is for things like carrots that I would store in peat moss. For things like potatoes that have a lot of moisture in them, we can either store them just in baskets surrounded by air, or what I do is I use wood shavings, and specifically I use spruce shavings. And again, it's because they have conditions around them that prevents pests and bacteria. And what it does is when those potatoes start to, if you've ever stored potatoes, if one goes, they all go. That's a big problem with potato storage. So what they do is they actually encase that potato with wood shavings, and the moisture coming from that potato kind of creates this crust with wood shavings around it, so it doesn't make all the rest go bad. So there's lots of things we can do for cold storage. There's so many options, whether we have a root cellar or not. But you're right, that is such an important thought about keeping produce fresh. One of the things that we also teach is how to use a refrigerator like a cold storage. And if you're in an apartment, you can still properly store your food so it lasts for a long time. My son's father lived in a trailer not too far from where I live, and I put a whole bunch of carrots in his refrigerator, and they were just stored in just the right way that they lasted for months and months and months and months. So there's definitely things that we can do to keep our produce fresh for a long period of time. Thank you for that question.
Adding
What
to
other
that,
questions do you see there?
Natalie, I'm just going to add a little bit to that. Working with carrots, especially in places that get quite cold, the ground itself is a wonderful insulator. And so if you are in a place like I am, where similarly to Natalie, we get 5 to 6 months of winter, what I'll do is before we get into the fall rains, I'll put up a small polytunnel. So just a little bit of 1/2 inch poly pipe with rebar stakes. And then I'll stretch out a rope in the middle. So I'll tie it to each of the apex of each of the hoops. And then I'll throw on 3, 5, 6 mil poly, transparent material that you can create little greenhouses. And what's incredible about this is that I don't then have to pick up all my carrots and I don't have to bring them inside. I can leave them in the ground, because what happens in terms of leaving food in the ground is that if it gets wet, the soil gets wet and then it freezes, then that vegetable freezes as well. So last year, I was able to keep a 3-foot by 32-foot row of carrots, about 600 pounds of carrots just in the ground. And there's no small level of joy to go out in January and February, remove the snow off your polytunnel, flip it over, and then dig solidly into loose ground to pull out fresh, crisp carrots that you didn't have to pull up, you didn't have to put in any sort of situation. It doesn't work for everybody, but it does have a certain application when you're looking at this. We have one question in the Q&A. We'll be discussing soil health in the course. Yes, we do talk about soil health, and we talk about building soil. Both Natalie and I have been building soil for a number of years, and so we're really excited to share what we know about that. So getting back to a couple of questions, we had one up here. Have you consulted for communities? Mine is isolated to marine and air access. 95% of the food is imported. Scary. We could do with a food shed study here. Thanks for that idea. Yes, indeed, Robert. Both Natalie and I separately and then together have worked with communities and helped communities to build their food security. I know Natalie has worked with a number of First Nation communities, really coming from a perspective of honoring the traditions that are there and the conversations that came before. Natalie, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Javan. Yeah, we always come back to everybody's context is very unique, and some communities have incredibly unique contexts, especially where I am, northern communities that often are fly-in only communities. So, there's many different ways that we can begin to build food security in a community. Sometimes it's by sharing those traditional skills that kept the people in those communities alive for thousands of years. So one of the programs that I'm working with right now is all around rebuilding our relationship with the land through food. And we're doing that through ceremonies, through my nation and the nations that I live around, and reestablishing those important relationships with the soil microorganisms, with those rooted relatives, we call them, those plants, the trees, and having strong relationships with them, not only of stewardship, but of knowledge of how it is that those plants nourished our peoples for so long. But then there's also other contexts, even northern cities. So we have places like Yellowknife that are really quite far north, and food costs up there get quite high because of the transportation costs. So we can look at different tools in our toolkit of building food security in spaces like that. Now, some of the challenges in northern communities are also that the soil is quite acidic, it's boggy, and or there's very little soil. So where I live, I moved out onto land that was raw, and so there had been no disturbance here for a very long time, and it was a boreal forest essentially, or a mixed boreal forest. And I had 1 inch of topsoil on there after we cleared for the house and the gardens and the greenhouse and the animal pens. There was just 1 inch of soil. And so it's taken a few years, but I now have 8 inches of deep, loose, loamy black soil there. And so sometimes what we're doing is we're actually building soil in those spaces to be able to grow food. One of the things that I think is consistent across most places is that we have a relationship with that space, and we are the dependent beings in almost all spaces. The deer, the caribou, the moose, they're not relying on us per se for their survival. They're relying on us to be good stewards, but we rely on everything else. We are the younger siblings on this planet. And so we're learning about those unique interactions with specific communities all the time, and learning how to strengthen those relationships. So in short, the question, do you work with specific communities? Yeah, absolutely, we do. It just depends really what that community needs and what their specific context is. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, great question. So we talked about root shellers, lots of conversation about carrots and damp sand and 5-gallon buckets from Kathy, good up to 6 months. Our root cellar will be in ground below grade as well, Northwestern Ontario. Any tips for people in apartments? What do you think of container gardens? Natalie, do you want to kick us off and I can jump in after?
Yeah, that's how I started. I wasn't in an apartment, but I was renting. And I was renting a townhouse. And so in large cities, often townhouses will have like a cement pad as a yard. And so that's what I had. And I remember being 9 months pregnant and thinking, I'm going to build some raised bed planters. And so I did, and went and lifted whole, 3.9 cubic yard or cubic foot containers of peat moss and soil from the garden center and dragging them over. And I'm pretty sure that's why I ended up going into labor the next day. But to grow food. And I remember the postman in the area would come into the yard and would sometimes knock on the door and just say, I just want to tell you how beautiful your garden is. And it was just basic, 1x4, 1x6 raised bed planters that I built. They weren't the most durable, but there are amazing designs for raised bed planters and containers. Right now, I think both Javan and I are pretty enamored by the idea of self-watering raised bed planters. And so we're both working on our strategies for that, just to address some of the drought considerations in both of the regions where we live. So there's lots of different ways to grow in raised bed planters and in containers. And you can actually grow a considerable amount of food that way, just depending on, again, how much space you have for those containers. One of the people in the 60-day food security challenge program that I'm in, she's in an apartment and she started growing microgreens for her family. And that's not a big volume of food, but the nutrition in that food is absolutely phenomenal. So there's always an option. And yeah, that's one of the things that we often end up looking at is alternative gardening methods. Those with a big garden and big space, they've got their method and they use that method to grow their food. But there's things like lasagna gardening. If you've got an urban city lot and you don't want to tear up the grass, you don't have a lot of time to get started, you could start with lasagna gardening. You can start with raised bed planters. There's so many different options for sure.
Be
That's
really
great.
interesting. Now, have you ever had a student who's in an apartment and they were issued a challenge, grow the maximum amount of food that you can in an apartment, or an apartment and maybe like 50 square feet outside? Because I imagine, like, I'm in a place right now where all I really have access to while I get a new place is a community garden, but I'm thinking inside, like, yeah, what can I do inside? Of course, I could do krauts. Of course, I could store potatoes and sweet potatoes in a better way, but like I could have like mushroom bags hanging from areas that are moist. I could do microgreens. I could have like herb patches just all over the little patio. And I'm just thinking other ideas for spaces that are, if you're in urban space or if you're in a very temporary suburban space, what are some ideas for rapid food growing?
One of the coolest that I saw and that I tried when I was in a rental was using window space as vertical growing space. So this was using pop bottles that were suspended above each other, each with a plant growing in it and a little bit of soil. And you would water the top one and all the water would percolate down through each of the layers down through the bottom. And you can grow lettuce that way. You can grow herbs that way. All of those foods that are really fast to grow, like you could grow kale. If you used some smaller kale or spinach, you could grow that way. Lettuce was what I did, and then specific herbs that I was accustomed to growing. And so this is a really unique way of growing using a window space. So it's almost like you're making a curtain out of your bottles that all hang down all the way across that window space. And you can use that to grow food, absolutely. There are window planter boxes that you can get for putting in your window space. I also remember getting one of those metal shelves and just putting it right up in front of the window and having trays of vegetables growing in trays lining that shelf. So there's always things that we can do, even if we're not even talking about using grow lights or LEDs or hydroponics and all those really more technical advanced ways of growing indoors. We can use really basic growing methods to produce some food for our families. And I think the idea of how much can you grow in an urban space as a challenge, that's a freaking phenomenal idea. I think there could be some incredibly creative things that come out of something like that. But that curtain idea of having the food growing along or down the window, that's one of the most unique that I've seen.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. What have you found? This is my last selfish question. What have you found has been one of your most reliable go-to, nutrient dense staples that you've grown where you are?
The types of foods that we grow is going to be really specific to the types of foods our families will eat. And so the biggest crops that I grow where I am are potatoes, just because there's a million and one ways to eat a potato and they're delicious. So I love growing potatoes. They grow everywhere. And in almost any conditions, potatoes will grow. The second is carrots and beets. So those root veggies are really important in my family. We rely on those a lot, mostly because they store so effectively for such a long period of time. Beyond that, beans are a really important one, also because they're using that vertical space in the garden. And then I'll get into greens. So kale and our lettuce, which is mostly seasonal. It doesn't last forever. However, there are ways to cold store lettuce, so it'll last for weeks and weeks. Those are the biggest ones for me. And then peas. We grow a lot of peas just because our family loves peas. But so that's beans, peas, carrots, potatoes, beets, and then onions are the other big one. And we grow a lot of this because that's what we eat. That's what my family eats a lot of. And so that's why we grow that. In terms of what's most nutritious, that's the food we forage. I forage for blueberries and Saskatoon berries. I believe you guys call them service berries or June berries in certain places. So these are a blueberry that grows on a short tree or a big bush. And we forage for a lot of those. We forage for raspberries. And one of the most nutritious foods that we forage for, I guess 2 or 3, are nettles, lamb's quarters, which some places call pigweed. It's related to pigweed. It's an amaranth. And the last one is fireweed shoots. Now, I believe fireweed grows everywhere in North America, but I know there's some climates where perhaps it doesn't do as well. It grows all over the place where I live. And those shoots that come out of the ground really early in the spring, they both look like and taste like asparagus. And in my culture, we jokingly call it Métis asparagus. It's the asparagus for people who can't go buy asparagus. And I ferment that into a wild sauerkraut, those herbs, so those lamb's quarters, those nettles, and those asparagus shoots. I'll make a kimchi with that by fermenting it with a bit of cabbage. And hoo-wee, that is nutritious, and delicious food. So most of the nutrient dense food is what I'm foraging, but the bulk majority of what my family is eating are those root veggies and those peas and beans and onions from my garden.
Nice. Thank you for the answer. That was awesome. Yeah, it really goes. Foraging is such a cool tool. You forget about that, especially like I'm near unlimited blackberries, but only in August. And so it's like only if you could store just the smallest fraction of that, or when blueberry season hits. And things like nettle, amazing. Nettle pesto, nettle pasta, like it's an incredible ingredient if you could just source that one area where it grows consistently. So yeah, really appreciate that. That's a really cool answer. Like I wouldn't even imagine wild foraging your own krauts. That's really cool. All right, folks, anyone have any other questions? It's kind of like open discussion time. Otherwise we could end this early, but would love to hear if anyone else has any other things that you want to ask Natalie or Javan.
Looks like we have a few in the Q&A. The first one from Ellen: has anyone used recycled bubble wrap for covering left in the ground root vegetables in the coastal climate? I've never done that. I can't speak to it. Natalie, I don't know if you've had experience with that.
I haven't. Typically where I live, we cover the rows in the garden. If you're going to leave something in the garden as a form of cold storage, we cover it with straw. And what Javan mentioned earlier about leaving food in the ground, the most important thing is to stop water from touching that food for the last several weeks of the season, so that that water can drain away and the ground will not freeze solid, so it will remain loose. So typically covering it is really important, and you could cover it with that bubble wrap, I'm certain, just like Javan said that he's doing with that poly in those low tunnels. So you could do the same with a tarp, so long as it's a really good quality tarp and it's not going to be letting water in. But that bubble wrap would absolutely work. And it's going to add a small amount of insulation. So the reason we use straw where I am is we'll use like a foot of straw on top of the garden bed. After it's dried out, just put that straw down. And what that does is it, in my area, is going to insulate, and it's going to prevent the snow from freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing right on the soil and creating a crust where we can't get to the food that's still in the ground. So you just lift over the straw, move it off to the side, and then you can dig up what's underneath, even in the winter. So the bubble wrap would work. It would do a bit of insulating, but mostly it would be keeping the water off of that food during those last weeks of the fall when we need the water to not touch the food we're going to store in the ground.
Great answer. Thanks, Natalie. Question from Carl, a couple questions from Carl. What about aeroponics and aquaponics for apartment dwellers? I can speak a little bit to this because I've had some small experiments with them. Generally, what I found with aquaponics and aeroponics, especially small scale systems, is that the amount of management they take and the amount of embodied energy with the elements, the bubblers, the pumps, the recyclers, and the fact that it's a closed living system, that is to say that we have the living system within a structured environment, and that living system will always have ebbs and flows. And so if you don't run the system at 60% capacity, what'll happen is you haven't left enough gap for it to fluctuate. It can be messy. It can be messy and really frustrating. The other thing I found is that the amount you put into those systems very rarely comes out on the small scale. Every once in a while, I see not a terrible large scale aquaponic system, But generally on the small scale, definitely aeroponics, bottle ponics, where most of your nutrition is coming from a bottle, which has an entire processing process that gets that bottle to be nutritious, and then you're adding to, and then the amount of waste that comes from it. So generally, I haven't seen it level out. More so, I found that in small scale living for myself, I've instead reached out to other individuals that have land, be they front yards, backyards, community gardens, and made arrangements to grow on their land, usually either trading some food or they just want that land to be used. That's been more useful for me in terms of actually having long-term food security. And colleagues of mine have gotten into community gardens, but because they were urban, their community garden plot was purely potatoes, which I think made a couple of people in the community garden frustrated. But hey, if you're going to give me a 12 by a 6-foot plot, that's potatoes for a family of 2 or 3 even. And you don't have to go and water it every day, and you don't have to go and check on it every day. You can basically just set it and forget it and come and take a look at it once every couple of weeks. And so it's really about thinking in permaculture. We talk about zones, zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's about where's the center of human initiative? Where do we begin from? And then what's the frequency of usage? And so in urban environments, you may find that if you're an apartment dweller, your zone 1 crops are balconies and windows and a couple of herbs in and around your kitchen. But as you get to 2 and 3, instead of trying to bring all that food production inside a small enclosed place, which may not be properly ventilated, may not be able to handle the moisture and the humidity that happens when you bring plants inside, instead you're connecting with others who have land or larger scale areas where you can do containers and planters outside on rooftops, and really thinking of it that way. I find when we try to do everything inside a small place, we end up finding a built environment. Natalie, did you want to add anything about aeroponics and aquaponics?
Yeah, that's one that it intrigues me so very much. However, as Javan has pointed out, there's almost always an energy balance that is not in your favor on the small scale in those different systems. Now, if you look at it in our natural environments, when we go outside into our ecosystems, all of those principles are at play of nutrient cycling, whether it's through water in the soil or through moving bodies of water, and all of these things are present there, but it's at a big enough scale where all of the ups and downs are balancing out. And so in theory, it looks really, really beneficial, but I've never seen an energy balance flowing through that I'm just like, oh yeah, I need to do that now. I've always found that there's going to be a better balance somewhere else. And now there's going to be some people who, because of their context, it's very appropriate for them. And so sometimes it's going to be an appropriate tool depending on your context. But in my context, it has never been an appropriate tool for food production, even when I was in an apartment, even when I was in a small urban lot in a house, and also when I've been in a rural context. It's just never been there for me. There's always been something that I could put less into and get more out of. So that's what I will always do.
Awesome. Thanks, Nat. Another question from Carl. Any thoughts about rainwater harvesting for raised bed planters? Yeah, so I've done this before in many situations, and especially in urban situations. What we'll do is we'll take the water that comes off the roof. We'll make sure to leave at least a 3 meter, 5 to 6 feet gap from the house to where you start to put that water into the ground, because we want to keep the asset that is the house. We want to keep the asset that is the house. We want to keep it in the function and the condition that it is. And what we'll do is we'll use pathways usually to sink water. And so this is a way to dig down your pathways, and we'll usually layer in with big O piping. This is corrugated plastic piping that's perforated. And then we'll mound up chips of wood chips in that pathway. And then we'll grow into the bed in between the two pathways. And what's great about this is that we can use that water and sink it directly into the pathways. And then we can have that wetting area basically soak into the beds. The other way I've done this is taken direct rainwater and then run it again through a big O pipe directly through a hugelkultur. Hugelkultur is taking decomposing wood, digging down into the ground, or doing it in containers, putting it into the containers, into the ground, and then mounding soil on top. And what happens is, if you're using decomposing wood, it creates more surface area, it holds more water, it creates basically a coral reef for the soil food web, the bacteria, the fungi, the microarthropods, the protozoa, the nematodes, earthworms, and creates a decomposing compost really inside the bed. And so this year I did that with my site. I have a shop that captures about 30,000 liters of rainwater for where I'm at, and basically created a hugelkultur directly along the drip line. And then if you think of like a big E, I put soil back over that main tine of the E so I could walk on it, but that water comes off the roof, enters into the hugelkultur, and the hugelkultur is this big E, and then mounded up on the 3 tines that come off of it. And that fed that hugelkultur for the entire year. And this is the piece about hugelkultur is there's a myth that all hugelkulturs are self-watering. Not true. If you don't have enough water to feed the hugelkultur, it's not going to self-water itself. But if you create enough surface area to capture that water and feed that hugelkultur, or to capture it through a downspout and then to put it into a hugelkultur or into a raised bed, or to do something like a wicking bed, which I put a couple of links on in the chat, you can. So that's one of those ways of using rainwater harvesting if you don't want to grab or build out cisterns and all the rest of it, because in terms of water holding capacity, every percentage of organic matter we increase on an acre of land is roughly 20,000 gallons or 80,000 liters. And it's cheap, especially when we're talking about increasing organic matter in terms of either grazing management or working with liquid biological amendments like compost tea extract and compost tea itself as an aerated biological amendment. But for me, I think it's a great way to do it. And for a lot of people, it's cost effective. Nat, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, so there's also, there's so many different ways that we can use the water that's falling naturally throughout the season in order to water our gardens. We can store water in barrels. We can water from that just by dipping into that, putting a barrel under the eave or the downspout, and then watering our gardens from that. We can collect water passively, as Javan was talking about with hugels, where the water just sheds off of the roof, falls onto the hugel, and that's like a water battery, those spongy materials that form the bulk majority of the base layer of your hugel, those branches and trunks and semi-rotted wood, they're like a big sponge. And this is another piece of actually ancestral knowledge that's influencing the way that I'm gardening now, is that we used to take all the dead trees and mound them up underneath and just put a bit of soil on top and plant the garden right into that. And so it's more of a crude hugel, but it's something that was done because we would be away for months at a time hunting. And so we'd come back to food. And so there's that passive method, but then there's also a mix of the two. So one of the things that I'm really enamored with is raised wicking beds, where we have a water reservoir at the base of your raised bed planter. And it's done by using either pond liner or plastic, some sort of impermeable surface, and then some weeping tile. So that's large perforated black pipes that we put around houses to prevent water from gathering around our basements. And so we put that through the base and cover it with some gravel, and then a layer of a landscaping fabric to prevent any of that sediment from moving too much up and down through there. And then we have our layers of organic matter that our plants are actually going to grow in, and then ways for the water to wick up between those two layers. And what this does is it's self-watering so long as that reservoir is filled. So that reservoir might be filled from rain. That reservoir might be filled because you're directing your downspouts into those reservoirs. The reservoir might be filled because you're using your garden hose to fill those. You might have a watering system with some, like those floats in your toilet, where as the water level rises, it's a float valve. It's going to turn off the water. You could have those installed on raised wicking beds also. And what that does is it's going to give consistent watering to those garden beds throughout the season. Now that's a high-tech version of a hugel, essentially. So we can go from, really, really easy to execute and effective, or really, really complex designs, but really low maintenance. And depending on your context, you might prefer one of the other of those. But using rainwater is incredibly important for me, because that's all I have for watering my garden. And so sometimes I'm moving water around with a pump to make sure it gets to all the different areas where I am watering my garden, but it's really important. I want to add, though, depending on what your roof is made out of, it is more or less healthy to do. If you have asphalt shingles, you need to be exercising a bit more caution over how you're using that water. I have a tin roof, and then I have a 50-foot long greenhouse where water is shedding off of. So all of that is definitely important to use towards watering my garden. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but a bit of discussion on the topic for sure.
I just wanted to add in that in a lot of fire prevention and fire resiliency, when you're taking a look at fire risk management, especially for ground fires, we've got ground fires, we've got crown fires. Crown fires are up on top of the canopy, and ground fires are along the ground. In many situations, I've been able to design and install hugelcultures to increase the amount of fire resiliency that a house had. And so many of these different implementations have multiple functions. They can stack the functions that are being used. And it's an important piece to keep in mind, is that when we have one thing that does one thing, chances are we don't have as much affinity to keep it alive and to move. And as Natalie's talking, when you've got multiple functionalities with your rainwater system, it can be really effective way of keeping your eyes on it and keeping your motivation to it. I created a documentary years ago about fire resiliency and how we got into our fire situation. I just posted the link in the chat. So Nat, I know we said we were only going to go for about 45 minutes of questions, so maybe we'll just answer the last two I see here, and then we'll call it a day. Does that work for you?
Sounds good.
Great. What about pest management for apartment dwellers and gardening? What do you think?
Oh, pest management is one of those fun things. So in all areas of our world and lives, we end up with pests when our ecosystem is out of balance. So in the garden, if I don't have enough songbirds gobbling up insects, or I, for whatever reason, had to butcher all the ducks and there's no ducks in the ecosystem anymore to eat slugs, then all of a sudden we've got a slug problem. And this is because there's not enough balance within that ecosystem. And so in an apartment, there's very few opportunities to create that balance. And so we might end up with something like aphids in the house. And this is to the absolute disdain of household gardeners. So there are different things that we can use. There are different products that can be used. But it's also important to remember that we can only be so successful in an imbalanced ecosystem in terms of managing pests. But one of the things that I use is called neem oil. And this is something, it's a natural product. It is used in body products and cosmetics all the time. And what it does is it suppresses the appetite of the insects that consume plant matter that it is sprayed on. Now, it's important to remember that if we are going to eat that food, that we need to leave 2 weeks between the last application and when we eat it. It's not dangerous for us, but it is an appetite suppressant in humans also. So it's also sometimes used in diet fad products. So neem oil, what it's going to do is when, let's say, a cabbage moth eats from those leaves, it's going to eat less and less. So it's going to lay fewer eggs, and hopefully it's going to starve before it gets to that point. And then the caterpillars that are hatched at the base of the plant, when they come out and start feeding on that plant, they don't have a desire to eat it because their appetite has been suppressed. So that's how that product works. There are other products that can be used for managing pests like that. And I know that there are so many tips from different people about things to add One of the things that I found most effective is traps for them close to my plants. So I'll make an aphid trap, and that's usually going to help me manage them to a great degree. So there's lots of different things, and it really just depends on the plant. I mean, there's lily beetles that can get into our flowering plants. There's all kinds of pests, but for me, the biggest is always going to be aphids, and I make aphid traps for them to help with that.
Awesome. Thanks. And the last one, Natalie, and this is definitely one that I know you'll enjoy. What are your opinions of highlighting offal as affordable, nutritious food sources? Offal isn't awful.
Yes. Oh my goodness. It's delicious and so important for human health. So I'll highlight an example from somebody that I know who, one of the things that he's done for marketing is he created specific products using offal meat. And I think it's important that we stop calling it offal. People get confused with the word. They think that what we're saying is AWFUL, like it's awful. It tastes awful. That's not, it's offal. It's OFFAL. So I think it's important that we start reterming things. When in marketing, when we want to remarket something that's been on the market for a long time to change people's perceptions of it, we change the name first and foremost. So if you are looking to market a product in a different way, that would be my first step. Don't call it offal meats. Second, and this is coming from, I used to teach business, so that's coming from that background in terms of marketing, but also as a producer. The second thing is that we can grind liver and heart and all of those things. If there's a large enough volume of ground beef, you will not notice the taste in the ground beef. So just grind it into the ground meat. The second is to be offering to your customers recipes. And I mean like the best recipes that you can find for how to use those. And then the last, as I mentioned at the very beginning, was to create a specific product that uses those. So the product that this producer had created was a breakfast patty that included all kinds of, super nutritious berries and things that were being added into these sausage patties. And then obviously there was pork added, but then there was ground organ meats in that also. And I have eaten those and they're delicious. They are absolutely fantastic. And so it's a hot product for that producer because he's specifically marketing, this is a superfood patty and it tastes delicious. So that's a really, really great strategy to take, is to create a product specifically using that your customer base will enjoy. Because you know what? There's only so many ways we can market liver and onions. I love liver and onions, but there's only so many ways we can market that. The next thing that I think is important is to be talking to the food movers and shakers in your specific community and getting them to prepare amazing dishes using that. I remember the first time I had beef tongue and my mind was blown. It's my favorite cut of beef now. I do not sell the tongue. I am not willing to sell the tongue when I sell beef, because that's for my family, because that's like freaking tenderloin to us. It's so good. So make sure that you have people promoting dishes and talking about doing that work for you. That's not your work to do. You get a chef to do that work and to highlight that and highlight their skills in preparing it. And then you partner with them. You can have chefs come up with recipes to partner with your farm using those things. And then also creating a specific product with a local butcher shop that is willing to produce that for you. Those are some really, really good strategies. And then stop calling it offal meats. Call it organ meats, call it, nutritionally dense proteins, whatever you need to call it. If we stop using the word awful to describe it, people will start eating it much more often. So those would be my tips.
Nice. Yeah, there's a good brand. It's called Ancestral Meats, where they blend liver and organs and just regular ground meat together. And it's pretty good. Like, I love heart. I love tongue. Lengua tacos, amazing. Heart tacos, incredible. Like liver and kidneys present an interesting challenge because they're not inherently delicious, but when they're blended with other meats, they're great. Well, everybody, I think we've had a fantastic webinar. Javan and Natalie, I think we're cool kind of like having this be the end, I reckon. All right. Well, really appreciate you both coming to join. It's been fantastic. Learned so much about creating a food secure future. And, that course is going to be fantastic. And without further ado, everyone's getting the replay, by the way. You're going to get an email from Javan. You might get an email from me. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you guys on the course and would love to hear your feedback on the webinar. All right. Well, take care, everybody. And I'll talk to you soon. Peace.